My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the one people looked past. At family dinners, it was my brother they toasted. At holidays, it was his name on the big gifts, while mine got lost under the wrapping. Even now, when I walk into a room, all they see is this silver ring on my hand and laugh as if it proves I'll never measure up. But what they don't know is that this ring isn't a symbol of lack. It's the proof of everything I've built in silence. Tonight, in front of the very people who once mocked me, that silence will speak louder than any applause. And the question is, will they even recognize me when the truth arrives? I remember the glass doors of the Waldorf Astoria turning slowly, reflecting the warm glow of chandeliers. Walking through, I felt as though I had stepped onto a stage where every gesture, every look would be studied and judged. This was no ordinary charity event. It was a theater of wealth where the guests performed their roles with polished smiles and carefully chosen jewels. I wore something different. A simple black dress, square neckline fabric that caught no light. On my hand, a small silver ring, plain to anyone else, but grounding to me. My fingers brushed against it out of habit, a ritual I had carried for years. That ring reminded me that silence could be stronger than applause. As I moved past the tables, I heard the murmurs. Not loud, but pointed like needles slipping between seams. She looks like she came from a town meeting. Is that ring from a discount store? Their laughter was soft, polite, almost invisible to the untrained ear. I smiled faintly. They saw a cheap trinket, but I knew what it truly meant. Sometimes what seems worthless holds more value than anyone can guess. The waiter guided me to table 9, closer to the stage than I had expected. I glanced at the seating chart. My name was written over another, the ink darker, fresher. Someone had changed it last minute. Small details mattered here, and I noted it quietly. Rachel Morgan caught my eye from across the room. We had met in college years before her rise as a sharp PR strategist. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her stride purposeful. She leaned toward me in passing, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep the ring. Tonight it'll do the talking." Then she disappeared again, absorbed into the crowd like a shadow with a plan. I sat down, and of course Ethan was already there. My older brother, polished as ever, lounged in his tuxedo. His cufflinks glittered in the candlelight, each movement deliberate, a display for whoever cared to notice. He looked at me briefly, then leaned toward the colleague beside him. "Can't even buy a real diamond ring," he said, just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. The laughter came on cue, muffled behind napkins and crystal glasses. Polite but sharp. I set my napkin across my lap, the smile on my lips unchanged. "I like simple things," I replied, my voice steady. It wasn't a defense, just a statement. His colleague smirked. "Simple or not able to afford better?" Ethan chuckled, the warm kind of laugh that might sound charming to others. But I knew him, and he knew me. He had crafted the moment for one purpose: to make me small. The host's microphone crackled, pulling the room's attention. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? New York. The crowd chuckled, the sound breaking up the tension just enough. The stage lights shifted briefly, skimming our table before sliding away. My clutch vibrated softly. A message from Rachel: don't react. Let them believe they understand everything. I placed a hand over the silver ring and twisted it slightly, the way I always did when I needed to ground myself. Every time they laughed, I reminded myself where I stood in the story. And I knew this was not the ending. From the row behind us, I caught a reporter whispering to her partner. "Whitmore. Rumor says the name's on tonight's sponsor list. But which Whitmore?" Her gaze flicked to me, then down to the ring. I lifted my head, meeting her eyes with a calm smile. Let them guess. Let them wonder. Inside, the words pulsed steady and sure. He thinks he's winning. But tonight has only just begun. The ballroom dimmed halfway, leaving the stage bathed in light. I sat still, but my mind drifted backward, as if the music itself carried me away. One moment I was holding a glass of red wine at the gala, the next, I was staring at a Christmas tree glowing in my parents' living room more than 20 years earlier. The tree nearly touched the ceiling, covered in blinking lights and ornaments collected over decades. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon, heavy and sweet. My mother, Linda, swept in with a tray of gingerbread cookies, her voice bright and eager. "Everyone, it's time to open gifts." Ethan, only 10, then raced toward the mountain of boxes wrapped in silver and gold. His name was scrawled across most of them. He tore the paper with both hands, revealing treasures one after another. An electric train set a sprawling Lego city, and finally, the crown jewel, a brand new Casio sports watch. "Wow, Ethan." Linda clapped her hands, her face glowing with pride. "My son, you deserve this." The future of the Whitmore family. "Charles." My father draped his arm over Ethan's shoulders. His voice carried the weight of certainty. "You'll make this family proud, son. One day you'll stand on the biggest stages." I stood off to the side, 9 years old, clutching a small package wrapped in old newspaper tied with a piece of ribbon I had found and saved. My hands trembled as I stepped forward. "I made this for you, Mom." Linda took the box, her smile polite but thin, like she was already preparing to move on. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a wooden frame I had carved myself, rough edges and uneven lines, but at the bottom I had etched the words, "Family First." "Oh, a frame." "How thoughtful," she said softly. The words landed flat without weight. She set it on the side table, already reaching for her teacup. Ethan leaned closer, smirking. "Don't put it up, Mom. It'll ruin the room's look." A ripple of laughter moved around the room, Uncle's cousins, even a quiet chuckle from Linda, as though it was just a harmless joke. I froze, my fingers curling into the fabric of my dress. No one corrected him. No one defended me. The rest of the family crowded around Ethan as he strapped the watch onto his wrist. He pressed the side button, grinning. "Try the stopwatch, son," Charles said eagerly. "Let's see it work," Ethan puffed up, pressing the buttons with exaggerated flair. "See, perfect timing. Just like me." Linda laughed brightly, her voice full of pride. My brilliant boy, always destined for greatness. Every eye was on him. Every word of praise directed his way. And the frame I had made with such care, it lay forgotten under a plate of gingerbread cookies, as if it were nothing more than clutter on the table. That was the first time I realized something essential in my family worth was measured by labels and price tags. Effort, sincerity. Love, none of it mattered unless it was polished enough to impress outsiders. I sat down quietly, hands folded in my lap, refusing to let tears fall. I would not give them that satisfaction. My silence became my shield. My memory became my weapon. From that night on, I began to notice patterns. At school recitals, Ethan's solo always earned standing ovations from our parents, while my drawings pinned on the wall were barely acknowledged. At Sunday dinners, my father would ask Ethan about his grades, his ambitions, his dreams, while my own stories dissolved into thin air before I could finish them. It wasn't just neglect. It was a hierarchy set in stone, Ethan at the top. Me somewhere below, barely noticed. The Christmas tree sparkled behind him that night, casting shadows that danced across the room. He lifted his wrist again, the new watch ticking loudly in my ears. My frame sat alone, its wooden edges rough and plain, already forgotten. I whispered only to myself, "I will remember this." And I did. I remembered the way they looked through me, the way Ethan mocked me with no consequence, the way my parents let it slide because they believed his success would carry the family name further than mine ever could. Back in the gala, the microphone popped, snapping me into the present. The stage lights brightened again, pulling me out of the memory. My hand moved instinctively to the silver ring, turning it slowly as if polishing an old truth. Henry's voice came to me, the man who would later shape my path. "Real value," he once told me, "doesn't always shine at first glance." I smiled faintly at the thought. My childhood had been painted in shadows, but those shadows made the light easier to see. And tonight, I was ready for that light. The story wasn't about being forgotten anymore. It was about the moment someone finally saw me for what I could become. The summer I turned 21, I took a job at a small jewelry appraisal shop just outside Stanford. The sign above the door was faded letters peeling from years of Sunlight Bay Area jewelry appraisals. The place wasn't impressive, but the clients were men and women who carried velvet boxes with the kind of treasures most people only saw in magazines. I didn't stand out there. I wore the same white button-down every shift, my hair tied back, old glasses slipping down my nose. My job was to clean the magnifying lenses, write down notes, and polish the counters after customers left. To them, I was invisible. Just the student helper. That afternoon, the bell over the door jingled and a man walked in. He wasn't flashy. His gray suit was simple, the cut sharp but understated. His hair was silver, his posture straight. I didn't know his name yet, but the owner did. Mr. Lawson, the owner said, nearly stumbling over himself to greet him. What an honor. The man, Henry Lawson, set a small velvet box on the counter. His voice was calm even, but it carried a weight that made the entire shop fall silent. I'd like these examined. 2 stones. Same size, same fire. One genuine, one not. Let's see who can tell. The owner's smile faltered. I saw the sheen of sweat at his temple. He cleared his throat and reached for the box. Then Henry's eyes shifted toward me. Sharp, assessing, but not cruel. What about her? He asked. The one cleaning lenses? Does she want to try? My hands froze on the cloth I was holding. No one had ever asked me that before. The owner laughed nervously. Mr. Lawson, she's just an intern. Still in school. She's not... Henry cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. Let her try. The room went still. My pulse pounded, but I stepped forward. I pulled on a pair of gloves, lifted the 2 stones under the fluorescent light, and raised the magnifier to my eye. I studied the first one carefully. The sparkle was dazzling, but the light bent just a fraction off. I turned it in my hand and caught the angle again. Too perfect, too sharp, synthetic. My palms dampened inside the gloves, but I set it down firmly. I picked up the second. The cut wasn't flawless, but the light danced in a way the first never could. There was depth, life, a kind of weight that couldn't be faked. And then I saw it, the signature cut pattern I had read about in books, but never thought I'd see in person. I lowered the magnifier, straightened my back, and said clearly, this one is false. This one is genuine. And if I'm right, it's a Barrett cut. They only release a few each year. Silence. For a moment I thought I had overstepped. Then Henry laughed. A deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the cramped shop like music breaking tension. Correct, he said, eyes crinkling at the corners. Not only did you separate them, you recognized the cut. Impressive. The owner stammered, "Ma." She must have guessed Henry ignored him. He leaned closer to me. Do you realize how rare it is to see a Barrett stone? And rarer still for someone so young to spot it. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I just studied the way light moves. The angle gave it away. His smile deepened. You didn't guess. You observed. That's what matters. For the first time in my life, someone didn't dismiss me. He didn't see the quiet girl in the background. He saw skill, potential, value. The others in the shop shifted awkwardly, but I barely noticed. My chest felt warm, my hands steady now. I wasn't the little girl with the forgotten gift anymore. For once, I wasn't overlooked. Henry placed the stones back into the velvet box, snapped it shut, and looked at me directly. Real value doesn't always shine at first glance, but the right eye always finds it. Would you like to learn more? I nodded, unable to find words. That moment stayed with me. Not because he praised me, but because it was the first time anyone had looked at me and seen beyond the surface. He gave me something no one else had: recognition. Years later, when Henry passed and his will shook the industry, I thought back to that day in the shop. His words became a compass. Real value doesn't always shine at first glance. Back at the gala, the chandeliers caught the silver ring on my hand, scattering fragments of light across the table. No one around me knew. But I did. The first stone I had ever correctly identified under Henry's watchful eye was the very stone now set into this modest band. And it was only the beginning. In 2016, the headlines broke like thunder: American diamond tycoon Henry Lawson dies at 71. His photograph filled every financial paper, cutting ribbons at global summits. shaking hands with senators, his silver hair always perfectly combed. To the world, Henry was an icon. To me, he was the man who had once handed me 2 stones and asked me to trust my own eyes. At his funeral, I stood near the back, wearing a plain black dress. The pews overflowed with dignitaries, foreign investors, and celebrities from glossy magazine covers. I was a small figure in the shadows, yet I could feel eyes drifting my way, questioning who I was and why I had been invited at all. They didn't know what he had left me. They didn't know he had seen something in me long before anyone else did. 2 weeks later, I received the call that changed everything. It was his lawyer, his voice flat but careful. "Claire, I think you should hear this from me directly. Mr. Lawson left 30% of Lawson Mining in your name." The world went quiet. 30%. Enough to steer a company valued in the billions. Enough to make me not just a beneficiary, but a power. News leaked almost instantly. The internet devoured it. Unknown student inherits. Diamond fortune. Paparazzi dragged photos of me from old social media accounts, pasting them beside glossy shots of Ethan. Articles read, "Who deserves the legacy, the polished lawyer brother or the mystery protege?" But the louder noise came from inside Henry's family. His eldest son, Robert, stood before the Lawson Mining Board and thundered, "We cannot allow an outsider barely out of school to hold the fate of this empire." Within days, they filed suit demanding the court strike down Henry's will. I spent the next month in and out of the San Francisco courthouse. The first morning I walked in wearing a gray suit Rachel had lent me, clutching binders heavier than I was. Across the aisle, the family lined up with their army of seasoned lawyers, some of whom had partnered with Ethan before. The sight made my stomach twist, but I stood straighter. The lead attorney for the opposition looked me up and down with a sneer. "Miss Whitmore, what qualifications do you hold in mining operations? What experience in running a multinational corporation?" His words dripped with disdain. I met his gaze evenly. "None. But I have 10 years of experience evaluating gemstones, 10 years working directly under Henry Lawson. He didn't choose me because of my last name. He chose me because I proved my ability." The courtroom rustled, whispers buzzing like hornets. The attorney smirked, clicking a remote. Screens lit up with old photos of me in the appraisal shop, hunched over magnifying glasses. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "this is who Henry Lawson entrusted with billions, the girl who polished lenses and swept floors." My cheeks flushed, but I kept my voice steady. I opened my laptop, projecting documents onto the courtroom monitors. Dozens of Lawson Mining reports, market analyses, risk assessments, acquisition reviews, each bearing Henry's signature alongside mine. I let the silence stretch before I spoke. Henry didn't have me clean the glass. He had me draft projections. He had me run valuations. He trusted me to build foundations he later signed off on. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward. The attorney's smug expression faltered. Week after week, the arguments raged. They painted me as unqualified, unworthy, an opportunist who had charmed an old man. I countered with evidence of every task Henry had entrusted me with, every signature that tied my name to his. When the final ruling came, the judge's words sliced through the tense air. "The will is valid. 30% of Lawson Mining belongs to Miss Claire Whitmore." Flashbulbs exploded the moment I stepped outside. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones thrust in every direction. "Claire, do you have a message for the Lawson family?" someone shouted above the din. I paused, the cameras clicking like fireworks. Then I looked squarely into the lenses and said, "Henry Lawson never made mistakes about people." He saw true value where others refused to look. The crowd erupted, my words flashing across headlines within hours. But victory carried weight. A week later, I entered the headquarters of Lawson Mining as its newest major shareholder and CEO. Hundreds of employees turned their eyes toward me as I walked through the lobby. Their expressions were a cocktail of curiosity and skepticism, half waiting for me to stumble, half daring me to prove them wrong. The courtroom battle was over. But this was not a courtroom anymore. This was business. Here, every handshake was a test, and every glance could be a new war. And I knew the real fight had only just begun. The first morning I walked into the CEO's office in San Francisco, I felt the weight of the empire pressing down on my shoulders. The conference room sat on the 28th floor with glass walls framing the bay. Behind the long table, the Lawson Mining logo was carved in shining steel. Hundreds of employees watched me from their desks as I passed. Some gave small nods, polite and cautious. Others stayed quiet, their eyes sharp, almost daring me to slip. I caught a whisper float from behind. She may have won in court, but let's see if she can actually lead. No one said it directly to me. They didn't have to. I knew. They were waiting for me to fail. 3 months later, the first test came. I was invited to Sydney to negotiate with Fraser Holdings over a potential joint venture, a $2.1 billion deal. If it collapsed, Lawson Mining would lose its footing in the Asia-Pacific market. The Fraser boardroom was designed to impress. 40th floor polished wooden floors, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. When I entered Edward, Fraser was already seated, his bulk filling the leather chair at the head of the table. He was in his late 50s, voice deep, posture commanding. He didn't stand up to shake my hand. Instead, he gestured lazily to a chair across from him. "Miss Whitmore," he said, dragging out my name. "I hear you did well in court, but this isn't a courtroom. This is the global market." A ripple of quiet laughter moved across the room. The questioning began almost immediately. "Do you have experience running mines in Botswana? How familiar are you with Australian environmental law? What distribution network do you plan for Asia?" Each question cut sharper than the last, probing for weakness. They wanted me to stumble to reveal that I was young, new, untested, and I could see it in their eyes, how they flicked down at my silver ring the same way others had, as if it confirmed that I didn't belong here. I answered one by one. Calm, steady. I spoke of market forecasts, production data, long-term demand curves. I pulled strategies Henry had once drilled into me: vertical integration, cost control, cross-market leverage. Still, Edward leaned back, folding his arms. His smirk was practiced. "You talk well," he said. "But can a 27-year-old girl lead a billion-dollar venture? I don't want Fraser Holdings turned into a college seminar." Laughter broke again, sharper this time. It echoed against the glass walls, not cruel, but dismissive, as though I were a performer in a play they didn't take seriously. For a moment, the old ache returned. The same feeling from childhood Christmases, from gifts ignored and laughter that pushed me aside. But I tightened my grip on the remote in my hand. I advanced the presentation to the final slide. On the screen, a chart lit up the global diamond market share. My team had worked nights pulling the numbers together. It showed a 48% growth in Asian demand over the past 5 years, with projections climbing higher. Fraser Holdings, I said, has the mining technology and the capital. Lawson Mining has retail channels in North America, a network ready to expand. Together, we don't just compete, we double our market share. Alone, we risk losing ground to Africa and Russia. I let the silence hang, then looked directly at Edward. "You asked if I could lead this deal. The answer is simple. I don't need to lead it alone. I need a partner who understands that value isn't measured by age, but by vision, data, and results." The laughter stopped. Edward didn't move right away. His chair creaked as he leaned back, studying me with new weight. Around the table, a few board members exchanged glances. One of them gave the smallest nod, almost reluctant but unmistakable. The shift was subtle, but I felt it. I had landed the first blow. That evening, back in my hotel room overlooking Sydney Harbor, my phone buzzed. Rachel's voice came through the line, quick and sharp. "News broke already. Financial papers say Whitmore holds her ground against Fraser." I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, staring out at the water. For a second, I let myself smile. It was a small win, but it was mine. Yet I knew something else, too. In my family, this headline wouldn't matter. They wouldn't see me as the woman who had stood her ground before a global corporation. They would still measure everything against Ethan. And no matter what I achieved, he would always be the one they chose to celebrate. I didn't have to wait long to be reminded of that truth. A month later, an invitation arrived. Dinner at the Whitmore house, a family gathering. And I knew Ethan well enough to understand he had planned something. Something not in a boardroom, not in court, but right at the family dining table, where humiliation always cuts deepest. A month later, my mother announced a family dinner at the lake house in Connecticut. The email read like an invitation, but everyone knew it was a summons. No one ever refused Linda Whitmore. The drive wound past the lake still as glass under the fading light. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the windows of the house glowed with warm golden light. Through the panes, I could already hear laughter sharp and familiar. Walking inside was like walking backward in time. The same rugs from my childhood, the same oil paintings of Whitmore ancestors staring down from the walls. No matter how far I had come, Sydney boardrooms. Forbes covers this house pulled me back into my old role, Claire the Quiet One. The afterthought. The dining room sparkled like a stage. A long walnut table stretched under the chandelier, polished silver gleamed and crystal glasses caught the candlelight. My mother had arranged everything perfectly, as if the food and wine themselves existed to mirror Ethan's success. And there he was, at the center of it all. My brother arrived early as always, soaking in the spotlight. He wore a navy suit that fit like it had been stitched onto him. A brand new Rolex flashed every time he raised his glass. His laugh carried across the room, smooth, practiced, magnetic. My parents leaned in, eyes glowing. "Ethan, darling." "Sit here," Linda said, pulling out the chair at the head of the table. She fussed over him, pressing a napkin into his lap like he was still a boy, instead of a nearly 40-year-old man. I slipped into my seat across from him. No one looked twice. I might as well have been invisible. Dinner began in a rhythm of courses and chatter. Wine poured freely, silver clinked against china. The conversation orbited Ethan as it always did. He told stories of Manhattan courtrooms, of judges who praised his arguments, of clients grateful for his brilliance. At last, my mother lifted her glass. "Ethan, I heard you won that case in Manhattan. Wonderful work." Her smile stretched wide, her voice rich with pride. Applause erupted around the table. My father slapped Ethan's shoulder, his voice booming. "Son, you are the pride of this family. The Whitmore name is safe with you." Glasses clinked. Cheers echoed. Every face shone at him. I sat still, hands folded on my lap, lips curved in the polite smile I had perfected years ago. No one mentioned Sydney. No one spoke of Fraser Holdings. No one recalled the Forbes headline. To them, those victories didn't count. Then Ethan turned his gaze across the table. He swirled his wine smirk, tugging at his mouth. "And what about our little sister?" His voice was casual, almost playful but sharp underneath. "Claire, are you still dabbling in jewelry appraisals?" Laughter rippled softly. Forks paused mid-air. Ethan leaned back, savoring the moment. "I heard you've got a thing for trinkets. Maybe you should apply at Sterling Jewelers. At least then you'd get to see real diamonds every day." This time the laughter was louder. My mother joined in, a sweet voice hiding its sting. "That's a thought. Thomas Green is a kind man. Who knows, Claire, maybe you'd even find a husband while you're at it." The chuckles spread around the table. Some cousins smirked, others whispered. My father sipped his wine, silent but smiling. The stem of my glass shook in my hand. They didn't know. Sterling wasn't just a jewelry chain to me. It was already a target. A deal moving quietly under their noses. Within months, Thomas Green wouldn't be offering me a job. He would be signing papers with my name above his. I drew a steady breath, lifted my eyes, and smiled faintly. "Thank you for the suggestion," I said. "But I think I'll be fine with the work I have now." Ethan burst out laughing full and loud, as though I had told the funniest joke of the evening. "Fine, Eau Claire. A little shop somewhere can't compare to Sterling. Don't limit yourself." Heads nodded. More chuckles followed. They all thought I was stubborn, foolish, small. I didn't argue. Instead, I turned the silver ring on my finger, slowly feeling its familiar groove. My anchor. My reminder. Inside, a voice steadied me. "They think I sit here empty-handed. What they don't see is that I'm building a deal that will silence every laugh in this room." The conversation moved on. Ethan told another story. His gestures brought his voice, carrying like a man born for the spotlight. My parents hung on every word. Relatives leaned closer, eager for more. I let my gaze drift. The maple tree outside swayed in the autumn wind. The candle flames flickered. For a moment, I was outside of it all, an observer in my own family. Then a buzz inside my clutch. I slid the phone open under the table. A message from Rachel Sterling agreed to meet. "This is it, Claire. Be ready." The words lit up the screen like fire. I slipped the phone away and looked up. Ethan was basking his Rolex, catching the light, his smile wide. My parents watched him as though nothing else existed. I smiled, too small and knowing. This dinner was nothing more than a prelude. They thought tonight was Ethan's triumph. But soon, very soon, they would see. When the real stage lit up, no toast, no applause, no polished Rolex would be enough to protect him or them from the silence that follows humiliation. The conference room at Sterling's Chicago headquarters gleamed with calculated prestige. The marble floors, the brass logo in the lobby, the silence of employees passing by, all designed to remind visitors of a 100-year empire. To my family, Sterling was untouchable. To Ethan, it was the dream. And now I was here to buy it. The conference room stretched wide with glass walls overlooking the skyline. At the far end sat Thomas Green, Sterling's CEO. His suit was perfectly cut, his diamond ring catching the morning light with every move of his hand. Around him, a ring of advisors and lawyers, all men in identical gray suits. None stood when I walked in. Thomas gave me a smile that was equal parts welcome and mockery. "Claire Whitmore," he said, dragging the syllables. "The girl who lucked into her fortune. Quite a tale." I set down my laptop and notebook, my silver ring glinting faintly under the lights. "Just luck," I answered. "But we're here to talk about Sterling's future." That drew laughter. Thomas leaned back, gesturing to his board. "Listen to her. A 28-year-old thinks she can buy Sterling, a company older than she is by a century." The laughter echoed hollow and familiar, the same tone I'd heard at family dinners when Ethan made me the punchline. I didn't blink. I projected my first slide onto the wall, Sterling's profits, a red line dipping lower each year. "This is your reality," I said evenly. 3 years of decline. Pandora, Tiffany, and online competitors are taking your market. Sterling's legacy won't protect it forever. The room fell quiet. Thomas's voice cut sharp. "Are you here to lecture me about my company? I built this with persistence." I held his gaze. "And I'm telling you, persistence isn't enough anymore. Without a partner, Sterling's time is running out." An advisor leaned forward, smirking. "And you expect us to believe you are the answer? Even your own family laughs at you." Heat burned in my chest, but my voice stayed calm. "My family's opinion doesn't decide my value. The market does. The data does. And the data says Sterling is bleeding." Another voice broke in, quieter, hesitant. A younger advisor glanced at the slide. "She's not wrong," he murmured. "The decline matches our internal reports." Thomas shot him a look sharp enough to slice. "Robert, no one asked you to repeat confidential notes." I advanced the slides, filling the wall with charts of global demand supply chain gaps, and a plan Henry Lawson had once drilled into me: vertical integration. With Lawson Mining behind me, I offer efficiency. Sterling doesn't have. Mining, cutting, retail. Full control. You don't need another century of tradition. You need a lifeline. A lawyer scoffed. "Nice speech. But deals aren't won with PowerPoint." I smiled faintly. "No. They win with leverage." The final slide appeared in bold letters. "Whitmore Diamond Group proposes acquisition of Sterling Jewelers for $4.4 billion. The silence was instant. Heavy. Pressing. Thomas's face reddened. "You dare put this forward without my approval?" "It hasn't been released," I said. "But one signature and the Wall Street Journal will publish it tomorrow. You can join the announcement or fight it from behind." Robert's eyes flicked between Thomas and me. $4.4 billion. That's above market valuation." The other advisors glared at him, but the crack was there. Doubt had entered the room. Thomas slammed his glass onto the table. You think you can corner me? You've underestimated Sterling. I leaned forward. No, Mr. Green? I know exactly who you are. The question is, do you know what you're becoming if you refuse this? The silence stretched. No laughter now. Only unease. Finally, Thomas muttered, Don't confuse my silence with surrender. I closed my laptop. Of course not. But silence still speaks volumes. I stood heels clicking on the hardwood and walked out. The only sound left behind was the shuffle of papers, the weight of their own uncertainty. In the lobby, the Sterling logo gleamed above me like a relic of a fading empire. Outside, the Chicago sky glowed orange with dusk. My phone buzzed. Rachel's message lit the screen. The announcement is locked for the charity gala. The host is ready. That night, everything changed. I looked out at the skyline, Ethan's mocking voice echoing faintly in memory. Soon there would be no laughter. Only silence louder than any applause. The Waldorf Astoria glowed like a cathedral of glass and gold. Chandeliers hung low, spilling light across orchids draped on every table. The jazz quartet hummed in the corner, their saxophone weaving through the chatter of New York's wealthiest. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. Tonight's charity gala carried a rumor louder than the music itself. A mysterious sponsor was footing the entire bill. I stepped inside, wearing a deep blue gown, its lines clean, its fabric unadorned. No necklace, no earrings, just the same silver ring on my hand. I could hear them whisper just as they had the year before. She hasn't learned anything, has she? Still no diamonds. Still trying to stand out by being plain. Their judgment rolled off me like smoke. If only they knew tonight wasn't about appearances. Tonight was the theater, and every one of them was about to become my audience. The organizers had placed me at table 7 close to the stage. My parents sat at the head of it, beaming at Ethan. He wore a new black tuxedo, his wrist shimmering with a gold Rolex he was sure everyone noticed. Dinner passed with practiced laughter and shallow conversation. Then, just as dessert was served, Ethan stood. The waitstaff handed him a wireless microphone. He raised his glass, the crimson wine inside catching the light. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth amplified across the hall. Before anything else, I'd like to thank our hosts for such a wonderful evening. And now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to raise a toast to my dear sister Claire. The spotlight of the moment swung toward me. I stayed seated, one hand resting lightly on the ring. Ethan's smile sharpened as he went on. Claire has always been humble. Every gala, every party she appears in that same little silver ring. I often wonder, has she ever worn a real diamond in her life, if not? He lifted his glass higher, eyes glinting with triumph. Next year I'll make sure she finally has one. Something she won't need to borrow from a discount shop. The laughter came fast, loud, ricocheting off glass and marble. Even some of the photographers lowered their cameras, shaking their heads with pity. My mother covered her mouth to hide her smile. My father clapped along, amused by the performance. I lifted my chin and met Ethan's gaze. My lips curved in a faint smile. I gave him nothing else. No flinch. No protest. Just calm. Inside, the voice I had carried for years spoke steady and clear. He thinks this is his victory. He doesn't see that this toast is the start of his downfall. A hush fell as the host David Carter walked onto the stage. His reputation preceded him, respected, authoritative, the kind of man whose words silenced a room. He adjusted the microphone, his tone deep, unhurried. Thank you for that toast, he said, glancing briefly at Ethan. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the moment you've all been waiting for, the reveal of the benefactor behind tonight's gala. The lighting shifted. A single spotlight swept the tables and landed directly on me. Gasps rippled across the hall. I remained seated, my fingers casually turning the silver ring, as though I'd been expecting the glare all along. David Carter's smile widened. Please welcome the CEO of Whitmore Diamond Group, Claire Whitmore. A shockwave of murmurs spread, but before anyone could catch their breath, the LED wall behind the stage lit up. In bold letters larger than life, it declared, Whitmore Diamond Group acquires Sterling Jewelers, $4.4 billion. Cameras snapped wildly. Reporters scrambled for quotes. The room seemed to tilt as realization struck. At my table, silence crushed the air. Ethan's hand trembled. His glass slipped crashing against the marble floor. Red wine spilled across the tiles, shards scattering like fallen jewels. For once, his smile was gone. I stayed seated, watching him, the same faint smile still on my lips. I hadn't spoken a word. I didn't need to. The announcement had spoken louder than any toast ever could. And this was only the beginning. For a moment, the ballroom froze. The crash of Ethan's wineglass still echoed against the marble floor, sharp and final. No one moved. No one breathed. Then the silence cracked. Flashes erupted like fireworks. Reporters shouted over one another, their voices colliding in disbelief. Claire Whitmore, the CEO. Sterling Jewelers acquired. This is the deal of the year. The chandeliers above seemed to blaze brighter under the storm of attention. I stayed seated, fingers brushing the silver ring on my hand. To them, it was still a plain accessory. To me, it was the quiet drumbeat leading up to this symphony. David Carter raised his hand, steady and commanding. The room hushed, every eye drawn back to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice filled the hall. You are witnessing history. Under the leadership of Claire Whitmore, Whitmore Diamond Group has finalized a $4.4 billion acquisition of Sterling Jewelers, becoming the largest jewelry distributor in North America. Behind him, the LED wall glowed alive. My face appeared an image from Forbes a month ago. Bold headline across the screen, Claire Whitmore, the young CEO, reshaping the diamond industry. I caught the sound of my mother's gasp. Claire, Linda's voice broke into a whisper. My father's hand trembled against the table, the napkin slipping from his grasp. Ethan stared wide-eyed, his jaw locked, his face flushed red. His mouth opened, but nothing came. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for more. One journalist pushed toward the stage, raising his voice over the chaos. Claire, for years your own family overlooked you. What do you say to them now? The question hit the room like a spark. Dozens of cameras turned to me at once. I stood walking calmly toward the stage. My heels tapped against the floor, each step louder than the applause still scattering around the room. David passed me the microphone. The spotlight bore down on me. I could feel the weight of it, the questions, the stares, the judgments. For a brief second, I let the silence settle. Then I spoke. I have heard laughter my entire life, I said, voice steady. From living rooms to courtrooms. From people who thought value was measured in price tags. But Henry Lawson once told me something I never forgot. True worth doesn't always sparkle. Tonight I'm not here to prove them wrong. I'm here to prove he was right. The applause broke loose. It roared, shaking the walls. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering. At our table, Ethan lurched forward. This has to be a stunt, a PR trick. Claire, you can't. David Carter cut him off, pointing to the massive screen. The Wall Street Journal released the announcement at 8 o'clock tonight. This is official. The headline flashed in bold: Sterling Jewelers acquired by Whitmore Diamond Group. The air thickened with gasps and cheers. Guests pressed closer, thrusting business cards toward me, asking for meetings, wanting to touch the moment. Cameras broadcasted it, live streaming my words across the country. I looked out and saw Ethan collapse back into his chair, eyes empty, his hands gripping the edge of the table. My mother's lips were pressed into a thin line. My father stared at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I lowered my head in thanks, fingers brushing the silver ring again. The ring that once drew sneers was now the symbol of an empire. The ovation surged. For the first time, the laughter wasn't at my expense. The stage that once belonged to Ethan now belonged to me. But even as I smiled, a thought whispered beneath the noise. This wasn't the end. Public humiliation was just the opening act. The real consequences, the collapse of everything they had clung to, were still waiting beyond these walls. I stepped off the stage slowly. the applause still shaking the chandelier crystals. As I glanced back at my family's table, their silence was louder than any cheer in the room. And in that silence, I heard the promise of what was coming. The applause still rolled through the ballroom, but it began to fade into a murmur as I handed the microphone back to David Carter. I stepped down from the stage heels, clicking against the polished floor, and every eye followed. There was no laughter anymore, only acknowledgement tinged with disbelief. I returned to table 7 where my family sat rigid. Ethan stared into an empty glass, his face pale and tight. My mother Linda fussed nervously with the edge of the linen tablecloth, as if smoothing the fabric could erase what had just happened. My father's grip on his glass was so firm his knuckles turned white. David's voice filled the air once more warm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us raise a toast to Claire Whitmore, the woman who has redefined the jewelry industry in America." The entire hall rose in unison, glasses lifted high. The chorus of cheers rolled across the chandeliers like thunder. But table 7 remained still. No raised glasses. No applause. Just a void in the middle of celebration, and every camera in the room caught it. From the next table, whispers slipped through the noise. "Why aren't they clapping?" a woman asked softly. "Embarrassing. Her own family," a man muttered, shaking his head. The words cut through the air, carrying further than they realized. I saw lenses tilt, reporters zoom in. A murmur rippled through the press row. "Isn't that her brother? The one who mocked the silver ring earlier?" Another nodded, already typing furiously front-page material. Ethan suddenly pushed himself to his feet, his chair scraping loudly. His voice cracked as he tried to project authority. "This is nothing but a publicity stunt. Claire isn't capable of running Sterling. These flashy announcements collapse all the time. I'm a lawyer. I know how these things unravel." His words echoed through the microphone system, carried across the glittering room. But instead of support, he was met with a wave of cold stares. David, still calm, lifted his hand. On cue, the technicians switched the LED screen behind the stage. The Wall Street Journal headline flashed in bold: "Sterling officially acquired by Whitmore Diamond Group. Signed 30 minutes before Gala." The timestamp glowed beneath the text. Gasps cut through the silence. Investors at nearby tables leaned toward one another, whispering, "He's lying. He just humiliated himself." Ethan's face was drained of color. His lips moved, yet no sound came. He sank slowly back into his chair, shrinking into the very spotlight he once tried to command. Linda, desperate to recover, rose shakily. Her voice trembled. "Claire, we are family. We should celebrate with each other." Ethan tried to add, his voice breaking. "She's turning everyone against us." I turned the silver ring on my finger, letting it catch the light. My smile was small but unyielding. "No, Ethan," I said quietly but firmly. "You did that yourself." The words landed heavy, slicing through the air, sharper than any headline. A stillness spread deeper than the applause had been moments ago. The cameras went wild flashes, strobing across my mother's tearful eyes, my father's bowed head, Ethan's defeated slouch. For years I had been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the sister shadowed by her brother's pride. Tonight, in front of the city's elite, the reversal was complete. The very people who had laughed were now trapped in silence, exposed under the weight of their own disdain. Linda pressed her napkin to her eyes, but no one offered comfort. Charles sat frozen, staring down at the linen as though the patterns might save him. Ethan's hand trembled on the table, his Rolex glinting a hollow shine against the storm of lenses capturing his collapse. The humiliation was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to them. As the applause returned, it washed over me, but I barely heard it. My focus was fixed on table 7, on the silence that spoke louder than all the cheers in the room. I sat back down, composed, the silver ring cool against my skin. Inside, a voice whispered with quiet finality. They thought the ring was a joke. Tonight, it became the verdict. And I knew this was only the beginning. The fallout from this night wouldn't end when the chandeliers dimmed. Outside these walls, karma was waiting. The next morning, the New York Times carried a headline splashed across its front page: "Claire Whitmore, the young CEO who shook the diamond industry." The photograph beneath showed me beneath the chandelier light at the gala hand, resting calmly on my silver ring. But the subtitle told a sharper story. Relatives who mocked her became the center of public disgrace. The press in America has a nose for drama. They didn't just want the deal. They wanted the family downfall behind it. And that was where karma began its work. Ethan was the first to fall. Within a week, 3 lucrative legal contracts collapsed. One of them was with Sterling Jewelers, the very company now folded under my group. Online, a clip of him toasting me at the gala, mocking my ring, and then being silenced by the LED announcement spread like wildfire. People cut it into memes, his voice sneering, "Can't even buy a real diamond ring," followed by the headline of a $4.4 billion acquisition. The hashtag #CheapRing trended on Twitter for days, but this time it wasn't aimed at me. It became a label stuck to him, a brand of humiliation no amount of courtroom victories could erase. My mother wasn't spared. In Connecticut's country club circles where Linda once reigned as queen of tea parties, whispers replaced admiration. The woman who belittled her daughter to elevate her son, they said. Invitations to luncheons dwindled, then stopped. The chair she had always reserved at the social club was quietly reassigned, and my father Charles saw his credibility crumble. He had spent decades boasting about Ethan at business conferences. But now colleagues leaned in and asked, "And what about Claire, the CEO of Whitmore Diamond Group? She's your daughter too, isn't she?" He forced a smile, but everyone knew the silence behind it. Meanwhile, my own face appeared everywhere. Forbes ran a cover titled "Diamond Queen Claire Whitmore and the Quiet Revolution." CNBC invited me on air. Each time I spoke about quiet wealth, about true value, the audience couldn't help but recall the gala clip, my family laughing at me only to be silenced seconds later. The contrast was irresistible. On one side, the poised young CEO respected globally. On the other, a family who had mocked her, now cast as symbols of arrogance blinded by pride. Even within our home, cracks widened. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Linda. "Claire, please forgive us. We are still a family. Don't let the press tear us apart." I replied only once, "I didn't create this distance. The family did that long ago." The words ended the conversation. Her silence after was louder than any plea. But karma didn't just punish, it revealed. One morning, Sophia Green walked into my office. She was Thomas Green's daughter, my cousin, usually the mirror of her father's smug pride. But that day she wore a plain work dress, eyes lowered, humility replacing bravado. "Claire," she said quietly, "I want to learn from you. I don't want to end up like my father, or like Ethan. Will you teach me?" I studied her, and in her, I saw my younger self, the girl standing unnoticed in a jewelry appraisal shop, desperate for someone to see her worth. I nodded. Better late than never. But understand this, Sophia, value isn't handed down. You have to earn it. Her eyes glistened. I understand. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't expected. Revenge wasn't only about making others pay. Sometimes it was about opening a door for those willing to step through, even if they carried the name of the people who once tried to shut me out. The gala had ended, but its echoes spread far beyond. The Whitmore family became a cautionary tale, a case study in arrogance, while I was hailed as the Diamond Queen. Yet inside me, I knew this story wasn't finished. Revenge felt incomplete if it ended with humiliation. To close the circle, I needed something more. Something lasting. Justice, not just triumph. That chance arrived with the next gala. I was ready to unveil the Whitmore Foundation, a legacy that would outlive the headlines and silence every last whisper of doubt. The Metropolitan Museum of Art shimmered that evening. Light from chandeliers spilled over marble floors, bouncing across frescoed ceilings, painted with golden constellations. The gala crowd moved like a tide of jewels, emerald necklaces, sapphire brooches, gowns that whispered as they brushed the steps. But everywhere I turned, the banners said the same thing: Whitmore Diamond Group, principal sponsor. I walked in slowly, wearing ivory satin. No diamonds, no glitter, just the silver ring steady on my finger. Once mocked, now immortal. People turned as I passed. I caught fragments of whispers. She's here. That's her, the one who took Sterling. Is she really that young? I smiled faintly. Kept walking. Tonight wasn't about spectacle. Tonight was about justice finding its final shape. David Carter, ever the perfect host, took the stage. His tuxedo gleamed, his voice rolled smooth through the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this year's Metropolitan Charity Gala. Last month you witnessed a shift in the diamond industry no one expected. Tonight you'll witness something even greater, not a business move, but a vision. The spotlight swept the room, then landed squarely on me. A hush fell. I rose, my heels clicking softly on marble as I moved to the stage. Cameras flashed a flurry of light. I paused at the podium, resting my fingers on the microphone. For a second, I let silence settle. I wanted them to lean in. There was a time I said, voice steady, when this ring was a joke. I lifted my hand, the silver catching the spotlight. I wore it to galas, to dinners, even when people told me it made me look cheap. They laughed. My own family laughed. A ripple ran through the audience. Some shifted in their chairs. A few journalists already scribbled, anticipating the headline. But this ring, I continued, reminded me every day that true worth isn't something you flaunt. It isn't measured in carats or price tags. It is measured in legacy, what you build, what you leave behind. From the back row, I spotted my family. Linda's fan trembled in her hand. Charles tugged at his cuff, avoiding eyes. Ethan sat rigid, his jaw tight, lips pressed thin. Their silence carried louder than any words. I took a breath and spoke clearly. That's why tonight I'm announcing the Whitmore Foundation. It will provide scholarships and seed funding for young women in jewelry and mining. Girls who were told they couldn't. Women who were ignored. For every one of them, this foundation will say you are seen, you are capable, and you will have a chance. The applause erupted like thunder. Women rose to their feet, clapping with tears in their eyes. Reporters typed furiously, cameras locked on me. From the audience, a voice called out, "Claire, why focus on women?" I smiled. Because I was one of them. I was the girl dismissed in the corner while the boys were told they'd carry the family name. I was the intern wiping glass while men shook hands over billion-dollar deals. And yet here I am. More applause. The ovation grew, rolling like waves. But at table 12, silence. My family sat under the same lights, but they looked smaller than I had ever seen them. Linda finally rose, voice quivering. "Claire." Her eyes glistened. "We are proud of you." I turned toward her, still at the podium. "Are you proud now that the cameras are here? Proud now that the world claps?" I shook my head gently. Mother pride means nothing if it comes only after the world has already given its approval. Gasps scattered through the hall. Ethan stood suddenly, voice cracking. "This doesn't change anything. She's putting on a show. It's just another stunt." David Carter, calm as ever, gestured to the screen behind me. The LED wall lit up with an official statement: Whitmore Foundation launched, funded with an initial $200 million endowment from Whitmore Diamond Group. The words glowed above Ethan's head. His argument collapsed in silence. I raised my hand again, ring glinting. This was the first stone I ever appraised correctly. My mentor gave me that chance. Now I pass that chance forward. Because real value doesn't fade, it multiplies. The applause shook the hall. The orchestra struck up, violins soaring over the ovation. I stepped back, letting the sound swallow me. For once, it wasn't about me. It was about the women whose lives would change because of this moment. As I left the stage, a line of reporters rushed forward, microphones out. "Claire, is this revenge?" I paused, smiled faintly. "No, this is justice. And justice is never just about one person." Behind me, my family sat still. Linda dabbed her eyes. Charles kept staring at the floor. Ethan silent at last. If you've ever felt rejected by the very people meant to love you, remember this: your worth doesn't vanish because they fail to see it. Family isn't only where we're born, it's also where we choose to belong. The path to self-acceptance may be long, but every step forward carries you closer to the life you deserve. Have you ever felt the sting of rejection from those closest to you? How did you rise above it? Share your story. Someone out there needs to hear it. And if this story spoke to you, stay with me. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it shines quietly like a silver ring